150 years ago, 3 gifted sisters lived in this remote place. It was a world dominated by books. From childhood, they all read voraciously, and in turn, they created their own stories. The sisters turned their isolated home into a factory of the imagination. From inside their minds, they conjured up new worlds and unique characters. They were the Bronte sisters, authors of masterpieces such as Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights. For all their love of books, the Brontes could have had no idea what happened inside their brains when they read and imagined. Only now, modern neuroscience has shown that the effects of reading can be more extraordinary than they could ever have dreamt. New imaging technology like fMRI scanning allows us to observe the living brain at work. It's shown that reading, something most of us take for granted, can help unlock remarkable powers. Reading builds new connections in the brain, which in turn allow us to use written words as stepping stones to understand other people's worlds. A good book literally has the power to change you. But the technological ingenuity that's given us brain imaging has also spawned fabulous new media, the internet, blogs and video games. It's a digital revolution that some think challenges the old world of reading. Time to show why, more than ever, reading matters. I've always been fascinated by the way that things work, which is why I write about science. The most fascinating thing of all is this, the human brain. It's probably the most complex machine in the universe, and in some ways it's the most powerful too. In fact, it's so powerful, it's even starting to understand itself. When I started writing about psychology, the brain was effectively a black box. We knew what it looked like inside, but what was going on in there was anybody's guess. We could only surmise it from the behavior that it produced. But that changed in the 90s when we got new imaging technology which, for the first time, could look inside a working, living brain and see what was going on. Since then, we've learnt a great deal about the brain, including the surprising extent to which it's shaped, quite literally, by experience. Lots of our cognitive skills, like speech, for example, are wired in, but others have to be custom built into each individual. And these include what is perhaps the most crucial one of all, our ability to read. And that's why, although most of us take it for granted, reading is so remarkable. Reading and writing don't come naturally, so to do it, the brain must change.
Human beings were never born to read. We were born to speak. We were born to see, smell, hear, but never read. What the human brain had to do was to rearrange its existing parts.
So, how did the human brain that evolved to speak make the leap to literacy? How did our brains get from recognizing this to knowing what these abstract marks on a page sound like and understanding what they mean? The first clue comes from the long history of our species. Our distant ancestors lived by hunting. That may not seem to have much to do with reading a book, but successful hunting depends on visual skills that would tens of thousands of years later prime the mind to read. These early humans needed to recognize fine differences between shapes, say between a useful stick and a deadly snake. Barely visible animal tracks could warn of danger or of opportunity, and honing these visual skills could mean the difference between life and death. Then, 5,000 years ago, those skills were adapted to serve another purpose altogether when we invented the alphabet and started to read. Ancient hunters became modern readers.
Part of the reading process involves areas that were and are being used for object recognition. So our ability to use our visual areas to immediately know whether that object is prey or predator is actually being recycled for us and able to be automatically recognizing symbols.
Today, it's impossible to imagine a world without trillions of words on street signs and hoardings, in newspapers, books, magazines, and on the internet. We live in a world saturated with written language. So how did the brain get rewired to read? To understand how we do new things, which we do constantly, you need to know two key things about the brain. One is that it's modular. That is, different bits of it specialise in doing different things. And the other is that it's plastic. The bits change. The modules work together to produce an almost infinite range of behaviour. You could think of it as a sort of Lego set that can be built up to do one thing and then dismantled and built again in a different way to do something else entirely. Same bits, different function. One of the most dramatic demonstrations of the brain's ability to reshape itself came from some surprising subjects, London cabbies. Their brains provided the living data for a now famous piece of neuroscientific detective work. It looked at a bit of their brain called the hippocampus. It's the bit sort of right in here. And it's the bit that we all use when we're finding our way about. It helps to code and retrieve knowledge about space. Of course, taxi drivers know more about that than any of us because they have to do this thing called the knowledge, which involves 2 years of becoming familiar with all the back streets of London. What the researchers found when they looked at the cab driver's hippocampus was that that bit of the brain was measurably bigger than it is in ordinary people. Right now, if you looked at this guy's brain in a scanner, you'd see that his hippocampus is firing away like crazy as he finds his way around these streets. And it's that constant firing away in a particular bit of the brain that builds that area up and makes the module particularly strong. The taxi driver study shows that the human brain can adapt to fresh challenges. In the case of these cabbies, storing an entire map of London streets inside their heads. So does that mean that our brains have a special part, like the hippocampus, that gets muscled up to read? So often in the study of the mind, the most revealing clues have come from brains that, for some reason, can no longer perform particular tasks. Last year, Terry Jones attended a friend's 40th birthday party. The day after, he woke to find the world had changed.
The next morning, I got up and go and have a shower, and I couldn't read what was a shower and what was a shampoo and anything else. It was just in another language. And I said to my partner, I said, they bought some cheap little shampoo. Can't read it, it must all be in a foreign language. And she just laughed, she said, don't be stupid. And anyway, she said, no, it's all right. And she said, I know you're joking. I said, okay. Anyway, I wasn't, but I just couldn't read it. So we went downstairs to breakfast, and we got the menu, and I just couldn't read anything. It just looked as though it was another language.
So when you looked at the letters, what did you actually see?
I could see letters, and it could say breakfast, and I could read letters, but those letters didn't make a word. If you understand what I mean.
So could you understand that B was B and R was R?
I could understand the B and the R, but I couldn't put them together to make any sense. It was though it was another language. I just couldn't read as a word. Checked in the hospital and had the various tests, and it proved that I'd had a small stroke.
Come on over here. Yep. If you'd like to sit up on the bed.
Terry's case fascinated scientists at University College in London.
So if you just want to lie back down. Okay, look here.
In the neuroscience department, a team led by Kathy Price used an MRI scanner to discover which region of Terry's brain had been damaged. They hoped it would help to pinpoint the parts of the brain normally involved in reading.
You can see it here, so we've got 3 angles of the brain here. Where this blue crosses here, there's a big black mark. So this area of his brain has been damaged, and you can see if you look on the other side in his right hemisphere, this is what it should look like.
And so what is the effect of that?
He's seeing it as a child would see a word. They can see the word, they can see that the letters are there, but it doesn't make any sense to them. So it seems what's happened with Terry is that he can see the word, but he can't take that visual information forward. It's been disconnected.
Is this then the brain's reading centre? To find out, Kathy sought out other people who had developed reading problems after a stroke. Careful observation showed that their difficulties were intriguingly varied.
A patient might look at the word yacht and say ship. So there's no connection between the visual in the word yacht and the word ship. And then there are other patients still who have a different strategy. They'll look at the word yacht and they'll go yacht, yacht, and they won't ever guess that it's yacht. And for them, they are successfully trying to sound things out, but they're never getting to what the meaning of the word is.
When Kathy scanned the brains of these stroke patients, each with a subtly different reading handicap, she discovered that many different bits of their brains had been damaged. This suggested that reading involves more than one small part.
So a lot of areas of the brain are involved, and they're all integrating together to transform visual information into auditory information, into motor information, and into the meaning. And of course, when you read a word, and you can do so in a few hundred milliseconds, you have no idea how hard your brain is working.
So there's no single reading centre, but a highly complex network, a cerebral internet. Kathy's work laid bare an intricate reading kit of parts. In tiny fractions of a second, the brain must decipher letters and connect them to sounds. Another part of the brain connects sounds and letters to meaning. Yet another stream of signals fires up parts of the brain that control the movement of our mouths and tongues, even when we're reading silently. If a single one of these connections is broken, as it is in Terry's brain, the system gets jammed. You may see letters but not a word, or read a word and not know what it means. And what is just as remarkable is that every part of our reading kit was originally designed to do something else.
There are no areas of the brain that only respond to reading. So all the areas that are reading are also involved in recognizing objects, in speaking. So in order to read, it's the connections between the visual inputs and the component sounds that need to be linked together. So this doesn't involve any new brain regions. What it involves is stronger and more efficient links.
So how do our brains grow these intricate reading circuits? These children are about to embark on a remarkable journey, the same one our ancestors took when they invented the alphabet 5,000 years ago, and that Terry has taken in reverse.
Let's hear the king.
Their brains must learn how to break up a single word they can hear into tiny building blocks and then link those sounds to the letters they see on a page and finally put it all back together again. For these young brains, forging links between sound and alphabet is one of the biggest learning challenges they'll ever face. And for new readers, one language is particularly tricky.
I think English is very tough to learn to be literate in. Most of the world's languages have syllables like you might find in the word baby or cocoa. They're just a consonant sound, a vowel sound, a consonant sound, a vowel sound. Whereas in English we have very complex syllables. We have syllables like stamp or break or bridge, where you've got lots of sounds in that single syllable. So a child learning to be literate in English has to first of all represent that package of sound very clearly, which is the phonological side, and then they also have to learn which bits of those sound packages correspond to alphabetic letters when the letter-sound correspondences keep varying.
But perhaps making them do that extra bit of work is also good for the brain.
Certainly in these kind of brain imaging studies you can see that extra architecture is built up by a brain learning to read in English. Now quite what that means psychologically isn't clear, but yes, the task is more complex and the brain responds by building up a more complex system in order to cope.
And as with those London cabbies, the more time we put into practicing, the stronger the connections grow and the better we get at reading.
We can make an analogy with your muscles, that we might have the same muscles, but a bodybuilder will build up their muscles so that they're bigger than somebody who wasn't a bodybuilder. And likewise with the brain, you can see that when you become good at a particular skill, you can actually see the brain structure changing and growing to accommodate the new skill. And likewise, if you give up on a skill, you can see the brain shrink back down again.
In other words, use it or lose it. The reading brain is a precious thing, and to keep it on top form, it must be maintained. According to a professor of English literature here at Liverpool University, there's no more powerful way of doing that than tackling the masterpieces of our tough mother tongue. And he's looked to brain science to show why. Phil Davis has taught generations of students how to read and understand Shakespeare, one of the most challenging and innovative writers in world literature. Phil became fascinated by what was sparked inside his brain when it encountered some of Shakespeare's most testing inventions.
A father, says this speaker, and a gracious aged man have you madded. Not made mad, but that sudden electrical charge of turning what is an adjective into a verb at one shot. Or look at this one from Coriolanus. Coriolanus says, "This last old man, whom with a cracked heart I have sent to Rome, giving him no favours, loved me above the measure of a father, nay, godded me even." Now this time we've formed a verb not from an adjective, but from a noun. And I put it to you, that is more primal, more exciting, more electric than deified me, the Latinate, or made a god of me. This is sudden, compressed, electric.
So, having felt these almost visceral effects
Yeah.
of reading Shakespeare,
Yes.
what made you turn to a scientist to
I wanted to know more about what was happening to me. This is not unusual. In the play itself, in Lear, Lear grabs hold of his head. "O Lear, 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 beat at this gate that let thy folly in and thy dear judgment out. O let me not be mad, not mad." So he's trying to get hold of his head, and I wanted, as I think we all do, to get hold of, to grasp what was going on inside. So I knocked on the door of a neuroscientist and said, my instinct is that these shapes in front of our eyes have an effect on the shapes behind our eyes. How can I test this?
Thank you very much. That's right. I'm going to strap you up. Make sure you don't run away. It's very important.
Phil turned to Dr. Guillaume Thierry at the Neuroscience Department of the University of Bangor.
Straps up, the cap down. Let's measure the head. Huh?
Rather large, actually, Guillaume, I have to say to you.
You know the size of the brain doesn't predict.
Guillaume used an electroencephalograph, or EEG machine, to monitor what happens inside Phil's head when he reads a series of sentences, including one using Shakespeare's intriguing use of godded to mean deified. EEG records brain waves, electrical signals emitted by the brain. Thierry knew that if the brain's confused by the meaning of a word, it reacts by sending out a distinct electrical response 400 milliseconds after reading the word. It's called an N400. If, on the other hand, the brain's thrown by the grammar, it generates a different response after 600 milliseconds, and that's called a P600. These distinct signals are saying, in effect, N400, ignore that, it's nonsense. P600, that's odd, but it means something. Phil and Guillaume tested 4 different phrases, starting with a simple control sentence that both made sense and used correct grammar. The next 2 sentences violated either grammar or sense. The big question was, how would Phil's brain respond to that odd word godded? What electrical signal would it generate? After analysing data from 20 other subjects as well as Phil, Guillaume revealed his results.
So let's take the first one. They thought so well of the hero that they deified him.
And in that case, you get neither an N400 nor a P600. So there is no sign of grammatical violation or semantic violation.
Essentially, this is the brain saying nothing special here, nothing to react to. It's just, you know, this is life.
It's our baseline, basically. It's where we start from. And then we can look at the different...
It's communication, and honestly, it's dead boring. So we're not interested in that.
No.
So which one would you like to take
I would definitely leave the functional shift for the end.
Because that will be more exciting for the viewers.
So to keep the suspense, I would rather keep the
So
one.
let's go for they thought so well of the hero that they printed him.
It's obviously semantically inappropriate, and what you're getting here is an N400 variation.
An N400 because it doesn't make sense to say they thought so well of the hero that they printed him.
So an N400 is basically the brain showing, oi, this doesn't make sense.
It does make sense. Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
And that's the kind of response we would expect. That's what we got. So this is very nice.
So here, in this collaboration, is sentence number 3. They thought so well of the hero that they candled him.
What we get is both an N400 and a P600. So we can tell that the brain is both shocked in terms of the content, the meaning, and also shocked about the form.
So the brain behaves quite differently if it's shocked because it's a syntactical error, as from if it's shocked because it's a meaning error, 2 quite separate processes.
Completely different processes.
So, 4th, last but no means least, Shakespeare, or Shakespeare diluted. They thought so well of the hero that they godded him.
What we get is fundamentally P600 effect. There is no violation of meaning. Meaning is perfectly integrated normally. But the grammatical structure, the grammatical disruption is produced.
So there's a big P600, a big kick on that word.
That's right.
But nonetheless, unlike with candled, there is no N400. The brain says, I can accept this.
So essentially what Shakespeare is doing is, every so often, just when he thinks the reader might be getting a bit relaxed and knows what's coming next, he'll throw in a kind of oddball word to get attention going.
You couldn't find a word that's more appropriate, actually. Is basically throwing in something that is going to be surprising, generates, activates these responses from the brain that are really genuinely oddball detectors.
So Phil, did you get what you expected out of that?
I think so. I think that what's clearly established is it's what scientists call a functional shift, a robust phenomenon. That's to say, it works every time, and Shakespeare uses it often enough for us to be able to infer he knows that that is an important instrument. I would say it's like an evolutionary tool. That's to say, it raises levels of attention. It primes the mind for difficulty. And the chances are that it may be that it leads on to the mind being ready to take different pathways from the obvious one. It primes.
Phil and Guillaume's unique experiment shows that Shakespeare's literary trick literally electrifies the brain. The expressive use of a noun as a verb acts like a neural kick, snapping the brain to attention. Shakespeare also uses a more common trick to rivet attention. He spins a good yarn. French writer Marcel Proust called stories the divine pleasure. It was one so intense that it made him reluctant to lift his eyes from the page. Recent brain studies suggest that made-up stories, far from being mere escapism, may provide the most energetic of all cerebral workouts.
Miss Catherine! 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 Miss Catherine! Catherine!
For many generations of readers, Wuthering Heights, the tragic tale of Cathy and Heathcliff, has provided that special pleasure. Its author, Emily Bronte, owed everything to her childhood and an insatiable passion for books. Over 150 years ago, Emily's father, Patrick, an Irish clergyman, came here to the remote village of Haworth with his family. He single-handedly brought up his children, a son, Bramwell, and 3 daughters, Charlotte, Anne and Emily. They would all inherit their father's zeal for the written word, and in turn create some of the masterpieces of English literature. I met Juliet Barker, a leading biographer of the Bronte family, to find out how reading moulded the minds of Patrick's children.
It was crucially important to him. I mean, you have to remember he came from a family that was basically illiterate in Ireland, a small tenant farmer family, one of many children, and he taught himself to read and write. And he knew the value of an education. At 16, he set up his own school to teach village children. And he was
Patrick's own children read everything they could lay their hands on. We now know, of course, that they were building up those reading networks in their brains. Soon, they began to create their own stories.
Well, we're sitting in the parlour, and this was the powerhouse of the Bronte family, because this is where the girls, and Bramwell too as a young boy, spent a lot of their time, because this is where they would gather every day to write and to talk. They would walk around the table, arm in arm, tramping round and round, discussing plots, discussing characters, discussing the stories that they were going to write. It was one of the interesting things.
Here in the parlour, the neural circuits inside the Bronte sisters' brains conjured up new worlds and characters. They called their imaginary realms Angria and Gondal. Even in adulthood, Gondal meant everything to Emily Bronte and directly inspired her one completed novel, Wuthering Heights.
With Emily, she might be doing the housework, she might be baking bread, but she could be thinking about her imaginary characters all the time. So Gondal was crucial to her, and she couldn't break away from that. So Wuthering Heights is literally a continuation of Gondal. Particularly the figure of Heathcliff, this misanthropic, violent character.
Cathy. In a burst of creativity, the story of Heathcliff and Cathy poured from Emily's brain onto the page.
And yet, she is not here. She's on the earth.
The words of Emily Bronte still possess the power to change minds, and even lives. Tom Palmer grew up in the next valley to Haworth. Just a few years ago, he would never have contemplated picking up a book.
I just didn't want to read books. I had other things to do.
But why? What did you think books were about? What was wrong with them?
There was nothing in them for me. There was nothing of interest. Why would I want to read a story? And why would I want to look in a book? Really, it was television, computer games, or playing football for me.
Desperate, Tom's mother gave him books about his consuming passion, football, to kick-start his reading habit, and the plan worked. Tom moved from soccer facts to the classics.
I found books that including fiction that I would just never have read. And one particular book was Wuthering Heights. For me, it was a revelation that I was reading about the kinds of places where I lived or went. And I was reading a story about a load of, like, sort of quite messed up Yorkshire people. And I loved it. And I remember reading, that was the first classic novel I ever read, and I absolutely loved it. And still doing it. And that made me think that I could read novels because it was relevant to me. It was about people a bit like me, or people a bit like people that I knew. And reading Wuthering Heights was actually a gateway to loads more reading.
For Tom, reading changed everything. He started writing himself, and today he's a prize-winning author of teenage fiction. Emily Bronte also believed that words could change lives. One of the most passionately expressed ideas in Wuthering Heights is that literacy liberates.
Time whereof
Go on.
the memory of man runneth to the contrary.
Yes, Madam.
Education and reading is absolutely central to Wuthering Heights. The whole point is that Heathcliff has been brought up without being taught to read or write. He's treated as a savage, so he becomes an uncivilized savage. So his way of getting his revenge on the families that's treated him like that, is to take Hareton Earnshaw, the young heir, and deprive him of an education. His saving grace is that he meets the young Cathy, the second Cathy, who teaches him how to read. And she is literally releasing him from the bondage that Heathcliff has created, and she is setting him free, and you know that they are then going to get together, and that they are then going to go on to the future and break this terrible hold that Heathcliff had had on them.
Ah, gotcha! Come on, rest! Come on!
And Heathcliff, Emily's imagined character, took hold of Tom's mind in an altogether different way.
And was there anyone in Wuthering Heights that you particularly identified with?
I did. I identified with Heathcliff, definitely.
You don't look much of a Heathcliff
That's
sort
good.
of person.
I was about 20-ish or something like that, and there's a lot of the brooding violence and aggression, and I had a lot of that in me. I loved him as a character, and I still do. Talking about it makes me want to read it again, just because he was so, like, he reminded me of a few people that I knew from the football.
Tom had discovered the single most powerful effect of reading, the way a book opens a door into other worlds and other minds.
There's a phrase in libraries, creative reading, and I think that reading is a creative act in itself, as writing is, because you are creating something while you're reading it. You're bringing in your own experiences. It's hard to put it into words, but it's something to do with when you can get into the minds of other characters and see what they're experiencing. It makes you better at empathising. I think that sounds a bit fanciful, but I think it did make me less of a selfish person. I don't usually talk about books in this way, but I do believe that fiction has helped me see things from other people's points of view.
The Bronte sisters no doubt sensed that reading could fire up empathy in some compelling but mysterious way. But can science explain this power? Emily's sister Charlotte seemed to think it could. She was one of millions who tried out that 19th century craze phrenology. Phrenologists measured the different bumps on the head, claiming they revealed what kind of mind lay beneath. They thought that the size of the bumps provided evidence of various human capacities, such as the ability to form friendships or to feel sympathy. In other words, how good our brains were at empathizing.
Phrenology was nonsense, of course, but it wasn't so daft of Charlotte Bronte to be interested in it, because actually it was the brain science of its time. And actually the idea wasn't so daft either.
Today, neuroscientists are intrigued by our ability to empathize, what Tom Palmer called getting into the minds of other characters. At Cambridge University, Simon Baron-Cohen has taken on the challenge of discovering the roots of empathy. Simon is an expert on autism, which he called mind blindness. In other words, an inability to imagine other minds.
His work on autism led to a fascination with how reading stories can produce such powerful responses.
Fiction involves imaginary worlds in the sense of imaginary characters, not necessarily based in anything factual. And the reader, whether it's a young child or an adult, has to enter into this imaginary world. So there are various steps of imagination. You have to put yourself in the mind of the author who's creating this imaginary world, but you may also have to put yourself in the minds of the characters in the text, treating them as real and trying to empathise with the characters. So when we think of reading as purely about literacy, there's obviously an extra dimension to it, which is empathy.
Neuroscientists have identified a network of brain regions that work together to generate our social responses. Some are located in the brain's frontal lobes, but these send and receive signals from a part of the brain called the amygdala.
The amygdala has sometimes been thought of as the emotion centre, partly because it's involved in the experience of emotion when you have emotions, but also when you're trying to understand somebody else's emotion. So you see somebody else's fearful expression. In the typical individual, the amygdala shows a lot of activity in response to seeing another person's fearful face.
And it's not just images of emotions that produce these mirroring effects in our brains. The movements made by these dancers are controlled by a region of their brains called the motor cortex. Brain scans have shown that this part of the brain that controls actions fires up even when we're watching actions being performed. So when you watch these dancers, or observe how a climber ascends a rock face, or how someone plays a piece of music, it's as if we are dancing or climbing or playing an instrument ourselves. Other people's actions are mirrored in our own brains. In fact, we are hardwired to experience empathy, as scientific work on our close evolutionary kin has shown. The way this mirroring works was discovered really by accident. A group of researchers in Italy were trying to find out exactly what neurons would fire in a monkey's brain, a monkey like these behind me, when it did a particular action, which in this case was grabbing a banana. During a lull in the experiments, the researcher happened to reach out and grab a banana for himself. As he did so, to his surprise, the neurons which were active when the monkey had reached for the banana were seen to fire up again as the monkey saw the researcher making the same action. It turns out that in humans as well as in monkeys, there are particular brain cells that fire up not just when you do a particular action, but also when you see somebody else doing that self-same thing. So you don't have to think about how a person feels when you see them doing something, because your own brain is doing it as well. What that researcher discovered by accident was empathy in action. So when we watch people doing things, we don't have to work out what they're feeling, because we automatically feel it a little bit ourselves. But can mirror neurons explain the empathy we feel when we read about other people's actions? This is what a group of scientists in Cambridge set out to discover.
Okay, that's the preparation done. You're ready to go into the MEG now.
They've been using scanners to see what happens when the brain responds to action words like grip or pick. To find out more about their work, I went to the lab in Cambridge, where I became the subject of their next experiment. The Cambridge team uses a scanning technology called magnetoencephalography, or MEG. It records magnetic fields produced by electrical activity in the brain. I'm now inside, effectively, or my head is inside a brain imaging machine, which is going to take readings of what my brain is doing while I look at words, and in particular, the sort of words which relate to actions.
Rita, are you comfortable in your seat? Hello, yes, I'm very comfortable, thank you.
Okay, then we are ready to start the experiment. Remember not to move and not to blink too frequently.
Okay, I'll try.
So there we go.
An MEG scanner gives a more complete picture of brain activity than an EEG machine, the device used by Phil Davis. It's a little like a movie compared to a series of snapshots. So when I read these action words, the Cambridge team can see precisely which regions of the brain fire up and in what order.
Do we get good responses?
I think we're getting something already.
Very good.
After a claustrophobic hour inside the scanner, I was more than happy to be released and to find out how brains respond to words. So can you talk us through what activation do you see in the brain when it's processing language?
The question was which brain areas become active and in which order they become active. And what we can see is first the temporal cortex activation and then it moves to the front. And the frontal cortex is, so to speak, the action brain.
So when we hear or read a word that's an action word, the part of the brain in us that would be active if we ourselves were doing that action actually comes into life, even though it's on the page.
This is indeed the suggestion. It is very similar to this concept of mirror neurons. If we use a word like to pick or to grasp, then this obviously relates to a hand action. There are also words related to foot and leg actions like to kick. And we have shown in previous studies that, as you said, immediately after we hear or read these words, we see activation in the brain that specifically moves to the hand or to the leg area, to those areas that also control our hand movements, that also control our leg movements.
Of course, the Cambridge work is just a beginning. Like Phil Davis, they've only looked at single words. But it does suggest that mirror neurons might explain some of the most powerful and mysterious effects of reading a book like Wuthering Heights.
Let me in! No! Oh, for God's sake, get away! Let me in!
As we turn the page to this climactic moment, Emily Bronte's language is not just comprehended, but experienced. Our brains respond to her words as though we were feeling and acting those things ourselves.
What the devil's going on?
The reader becomes the book, and the book becomes the reader. Of course, we don't have to read books to experience empathy. Our ancestors had for tens of thousands of years no written language, but for them, empathy was an essential survival tool.
We're a very social and hence interdependent species, and so the ability to know what's in somebody else's mind gives us some idea of what they're likely to do to us, and that in turn gives us survival benefit.
And when our ancestors eventually came up with writing, we found that reading could be more than just a way of transmitting information. It provided a means to muscle up the brain's empathy network.
When we're reading a novel, what we're doing is entering into the world that's being created for us by the author, a world of the imagination. We might stay within the text, or we might elaborate on it, create an imaginative world of our own. And in that rather safe world of the imagination, we can act things out which, if we did them in the real world, might have consequences that we wouldn't like to take. In other words, reading gives us a rehearsal stage as big as the world.
The power of reading to create empathy is even being used to heal troubled minds. Get Into Reading was launched in Liverpool and started with the traditional idea of a book group.
I think that's the worst motive you've given yet for being the wife of young Linton.
But this one is different. The readers here suffer from a range of psychological disorders like depression. When I arrived, the group had got to a key chapter in Wuthering Heights, the one in which Cathy agonises over whether to choose conventional Linton or the brooding Heathcliff.
Every Linton on the face of the earth might melt into nothing before I could consent to forsake Heathcliff. Stop there. And Faye, is this sort of state she's in something you'd aspire to? Would you like to be feeling what Catherine's feeling for somebody?
Definitely.
I'd love to feel it all the time, and I felt like that. You're like happy nearly all the time, and it can last for weeks, months.
It is a beautiful idea in one way when she says, I am Heathcliff. In another way, you get the sense that it could be very, well, you know, dangerous as well, that sense that
she's marrying someone under false pretences, really.
I can imagine it then from Linton's point of view. Imagine marrying Catherine, but then knowing that she's in love with somebody else.
Yeah.
Oh, and he will. And he will find out.
I think deep down she should be with Heathcliff, isn't she?
Is he the one where she's sexually attracted
I think
to?
so, yes.
And the passion?
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's who she should go for.
Jane Davis, who founded these reading groups, has seen some remarkable results.
People have reported, I felt better within 6 weeks or 8 weeks or something like that. So it's quite an intense experience, I think. And it's very liberating. I mean, I think for people who haven't read for a long time or perhaps have never been readers, it's incredibly liberating to suddenly discover this world of strong language that's about things you know about. There's something about the absolute depth of engagement, concentration, that the words enter you, don't they? They are part of you. Once you've got the willingness to engage with text, then I think the brain is being asked to do something more than simply absorb, picture, use imagination. It's a very active process.
Is there anybody here who has found that books have helped them in controlling mood disorders, depression particularly, anything like that? Would you mind talking about it?
I've had a number of strokes, and part of it then has led to, I think it's led to depression and very strong suicidal thoughts. And this time last year when I'd had a stroke, I came back to the group. I found that it's books and poems, it's words. It's just fantastic, it sends you into a completely different area.
I think if you suffer depression, it can be very, very low. And then all depression is pushing your feelings down. But if you read something that really touches, well, for me, it all comes out.
I've got a marvellous imagination, I used to have. So when you're reading, I used to be actually in there living what the book was saying. I lost all that. So I am now learning that bit by relearning it, how to, you know, get back into living in the book again.
My daughter said to me that reading has done more for me than any antidepressant could do. She's seen the change.
These readers don't need to think about the science that explains the way books can retune the mind. They just know that it works for them. We too may not be aware of our neural circuits changing as we read. But they do, whenever we live out the drama of a story inside our heads and think thoughts and feel feelings that originated in another mind. Have a literally electrifying effect on our brains. So just imagine the charge accumulated by the trillions of books produced since the dawn of the reading revolution. Libraries like this one provide, if you like, the raw material for all of that. Thousands of books, countless words, facts, stories, ideas, all the products of other minds packaged up and waiting to be transferred into our own and used by them. But the appetite for knowledge that generated mass literacy has spawned brand new media that some believe challenge the status of reading itself. In the last century, radio, then television, the analogue media, had by the 1960s begun to dominate leisure time. The rise of television above all provoked anxieties that traditional pastimes, including reading, would suffer. And it's true that the number of hours we spend in front of the screen has been rising ever since. Well, it would seem that these anxieties have proved unfounded. Here in Britain, many of us remain enthusiastic readers. In 2005, to take just 1 year, we bought 218 million books. That's a 30% rise since the mid-1990s. It might even be the case that television, with its classic serials, has made us read even more. But since the beginning of the 21st century, the spectacular rise of digital technologies like the internet and video games have brought a fresh wave of fears in their wake. In the United States, exposed to digital media for longer, surveys of reading habits back up these concerns. In 2007, the prestigious National Endowment for the Arts published a major survey that showed that in the United States, book sales have stagnated. Reading was at risk, the report concluded, with severe consequences for American society. Most worryingly, among young adults, there were marked falls in reading proficiency. The steepest declines were in reading for literary experience, meaning exploring themes, characters and settings. And that's the reading that matters.
In the last 5 years, you see our fourth graders decoding at a wonderful level. They're doing better than ever before, while our middle schoolers and our high schoolers are flattening or declining in their comprehension skills.
It's not just an American anxiety. In Britain, Baroness Susan Greenfield, director of the Royal Institution, has become an outspoken critic of digital media. She's convinced that they threaten the traditional values of reading.
When you think about it, what happens when you read? The author, the authority, takes you by the hand and you go on a journey. Someone is guiding you. They're taking you from a beginning to a middle to an end. Now, it might not be a journey you like or that you agree with, but for sure, intellectually, you end up in a different place from where you started. You've gone on your journey. Now, because the human mind will evaluate everything that happens in terms of previous experiences, because that's what plasticity is, it's the formation of connections that enables you to navigate the world, so it will be with this journey you've just been on.
There's one ingredient of the digital revolution that especially troubles Professor Greenfield: video games.
The whole difference between, let's say, computer games, which emphasize process, here and now experience, the thrill of pretty much instant gratification as you win the princess or slay the dragon, is very different from reading, which focuses on content, on narrative. And my own view is it is content, it is meaning, whether it has seen one thing in terms of something else, a narrative that gives a meaning to life beyond the here and now.
But is Susan Greenfield right? Does gaming satisfy just instant gratification? And does it really deny the values of traditional storytelling? This is the Game Base in Piccadilly, a paradise for video game enthusiasts. I wanted to ask these gamers what they think.
What's the aim of it? What do you do?
It's just to kill people, just kill each other, really.
In order to do this, you have to get yourself a bit worked up and a bit, I would have thought, a bit angry just to do it.
Yeah, you can get quite frustrated with, you know, if you've just been killed, like, you know, things like that. But after the game, obviously, you sort of calm down.
Some people say that spending a lot of time doing this kind of thing actually alters your mind and makes you into a different type of person. Do you think there's anything in that?
I can see that happening.
Do you think, and amongst the friends and amongst the people you know, do you think it's an either-or thing, that either you're on the computer or reading books?
I think nowadays, well, I don't think many people read not as much as before.
Why do you think that is?
Because it's easier to just play a game, isn't it? You have to exert yourself as much.
These vox pops don't add up to scientific evidence, and they don't reflect the intensely social and often cooperative nature of much online gaming. But according to Greenfield, if people choose to play games rather than read, they might lose that single most powerful effect of reading: empathy.
When you play a computer game, to rescue the princess is meaningless. You don't care about the princess, do you? You don't care about what she's feeling or thinking. She strikes no associations with you. She's something to be rescued as simply the prize, the end point of the game. Whereas when you read a book, you care about the princess. That's why you're reading the book, because you're caring about what she's feeling and thinking, what's going to happen to her.
But not everyone agrees. Novelist Naomi Alderman won the Orange Award for New Writers with her book Disobedience, set in London's Orthodox Jewish community. Naomi also designs video games, most notably Perplex City, which is played by hundreds of gamers in an imaginary city of the future. Why do you think people are so worried about computers?
I think people get very concerned about seeing their teenagers locked into playing video games and becoming very involved in them, and that's all they want to do, play video games. But I would argue that that's really just a part of adolescence. And when we're adolescents, we get tremendously involved and tremendously interested in a whole range of things, you know, from girls who rush to the front of a stage in order to see their favourite pop star and then collapse screaming because they love him so much, or when you're reading a novel as a teenager. I mean, you never love a book as much as you love it when you're a teenager.
Naomi is convinced that some video games can provide the same empathetic experience as a novel.
There's a PlayStation 2 really classic game called Ico, which is, it is a rescuing a princess from a tower. It's intensely empathetic. I defy anyone to watch 5 minutes or 5 seconds footage of this game without feeling tremendous empathy for this little girl. It's all done in the way that she's animated, in her looking backwards in fear, in her... He has to sort of drag her by the hand to get her to come along with him, and it's beautiful. All the character is done via the animation.
So the question of whether digital media, including video gaming, will undermine traditional reading habits remains open. The evidence just isn't available yet. In the 5,000 years since our ancestors invented the alphabet, our brains have been on an amazing journey. Reading and writing were the foundations of the first civilizations. "500 years ago, the invention of the printing press began to shape the modern world. And the journey continues.
Our reading habits may change as electronic media becomes as familiar as this process here, but reading itself will remain the key to a wider world, just as it was from the Bronte sisters in that Yorkshire vicarage. It gives us the chance to step into a bigger world and to see it in a different way. It can even transform lives. That's why today, as much as ever, reading matters.
Reading's journey from an elitist pastime to every man's hobby